from Democrats on the committee. Hegseth appears to have come out of the hearing largely unscathed, and his path toward confirmation remains on track, especially now that he's earned the public backing of Iowa Senator Joni Ernst, a key Republican, military veteran, and survivor of sexual assault, who was seen as an important vote in ensuring that his nomination moves forward. Joining me to discuss all of this is Tom Nichols. He's a staff writer for The Atlantic. He's the author of the Atlantic Daily Newsletter, and he's the author of Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy. He's also Professor Emeritus of National Security Affairs at the U.S. Naval War College. So he writes and knows a lot about this stuff. Tom, where are we at this point with Pete Hegseth, and what, if anything, worries you about how this last week has unfolded?
Well, one thing that worries me, Ali, is that people are focusing on the culture war aspects of Hegseth's nomination. You know, how he feels about women in the military, the clip you just played of Elizabeth Warren. You know, these are important questions. But I think what's getting lost in that is he will be the Secretary of Defense, one of the most important national security, national defense positions next to the president himself and the Secretary of State. And the Secretary of State doesn't have, you know, an army and 3 million people working for him. He is completely unqualified for this. And instead of worrying about some of his sillier statements in his books, which, you know, he was writing to sell books, I guess, think of the day when there's a serious crisis with Russia or China or Iran or some other part of the world, and Pete Hegseth is supposed to be one of the people in the room advising the president. He simply has no background for this. Yes, he was a major in the Army. I taught at the Naval War College. I taught dozens and dozens of young majors. They are fine men and women. But that doesn't make him qualified to be advising the president in the middle of a crisis, or potentially even a nuclear crisis. The Secretary of Defense is a job that is always reserved for someone who can meet both the intellectual experience and character standards that's required to be at the top of the Pentagon. And I'll just remind people, John Tower was a Republican senator from Texas.
Yes.
Had his nomination bounced because of allegations of drinking that were far less serious than the many allegations against Pete Hegseth. I mean, it really is remarkable that we're at this point. And I worry sometimes that people are focusing on the wrong thing, which is that Pete Hegseth has these very retrograde beliefs about a lot of things related to the military, when in fact, the real danger is he will have to be in the room during something terrible when we're going to need someone who actually knows what he's doing in there.
You've written a lot about this and about Tulsi Gabbard, and both concerns are similar in that we are in a dangerous place in the world. We for once don't have active troops fighting in wars around the world, but we got American troops all over the place, and we've got dry tinder all over the world that could explode into wars at any moment, despite the ceasefire that we will see hopefully within the next 14 hours in the Middle East. The Middle East is not a calmer place generally. As a result, Russia, Ukraine is not a calmer place. North Korea is not a calmer place. You're right. There's real nuclear. China and Taiwan, it's not a calmer place. There's real threat of real bad things happening in the world, for which we need the people who have the best and most sober judgment.
And the most sober temperament. And I don't mean that as a pun on the allegations of drinking. I mean a level and steady temperament. And I don't think there's any evidence of that with Pete Hegseth, who, again, other than having served in the military and been a morning talk show host, has no business being Secretary of Defense. And, you know, you can say this without it being personal or partisan.
Because I also don't have qualifications for it. Like, that's just the way it is. Right.
Right. It's just the way it is.
It's also, so here's the one possible silver lining here. 3 million people. Many of them are high-ranking people, colonels, generals. Many of them have a spine. These are people who have given their lives and risked their lives in the safety of America. He probably can't roll most of them.
Yeah, but, you know, I suspect that what will happen is the Pentagon will run without him his deputy at this point, normally the Secretary of Defense, when he's busy, the guy who runs the Pentagon is the Deputy Secretary of Defense. This nominee for Deputy Secretary has no experience either. So this is going to devolve into a bunch of fiefdoms and offices and little principalities who are going to pretty much, run either on autopilot or, trying to figure out which undersecretary or assistant secretary they should listen to. But that's bad too, Ali. You don't want to have a Pentagon where people say, oh, the Secretary of Defense said some stuff, but, who listens to him? You had a similar problem when Jim Mattis was Secretary of Defense, and Donald Trump would call him up and say, here are things I'd want to do. And the Secretary of Defense, even though Mattis's instincts were right, I'm uncomfortable with a civil-military relationship where the president calls the Pentagon and the Secretary of Defense says, we're not going to do that. Or in Pete Hegseth's case, the Secretary of Defense says, sure, whatever you want to do, Mr. President. And, I'm not really an advisor. I'm just a guy who executes your orders. This is really bad in every way. And I hope that somehow sanity prevails here. Yep. And there are Republicans who are perfectly credible nominees to be Secretary of Defense. Sure. It's not like you can't find a real Republican defense expert. Joni Ernst is sitting right there, among others. Yep. But this is apparently,
and her name was suggested at one point. And it is interesting because Democrats have had Republicans as secretaries of defense. Like it's actually not the world's most partisan job, but it has to work. And as a professor, you have learned in all sorts of countries around the world, including today, when you have those fiefdoms and you have that separation in the Defense Department, things can go really wrong and people can die. Tom, thanks for your analysis and your writing on this. Thank you. We appreciate it. Tom Nichols is a staff writer at The Atlantic. He's the author of the Atlantic Daily Newsletter. He's the author of Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy, among other books. Coming up, a temporary ceasefire in Gaza is set to go into effect in just hours. I'll explain what that could mean for